Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Hi, my name is Amelia Alexander, and before we get into this episode, I'm going to tell you a little bit about BGSU Votes and some upcoming deadlines. BGSU Votes is a nonpartisan student-led initiative that focuses on increasing civic and democratic engagement among college students. The next election is May 5th, and it's a primary election. To vote in this election, people must register by April 6th, 2026. In the fall, there's an upcoming election November 3rd. To vote in this election, people must register by October 5th, 2026.
Welcome aboard, everyone, to another episode of the Democracy Exchange with The Depot, the one-stop station where we engage in conversations to foster understanding. I am your host, Anna McRae, and today we are sitting down with Dr. Thomas Edge, Associate Professor in BGSU's Department of Ethnic Studies. In today's episode, we will be discussing the importance and implications of voting rights. Dr. Edge was my professor last semester when he taught a class called Race and Voting Rights. Dr. Edge, thank you for being with us today. I hope we can inform some of our audience about voting rights, voter engagement, and the importance of voting. All right, let's get into it. On the first day of class, you asked us, do you think it is important to vote, and why? And you asked that because the answer from what we said at the beginning of the semester was very different from when you checked in on us at the end of the semester. And I would like to start this podcast off by taking your inspiration and asking you, do you think it is important to vote, and why?
If I had known you would turn this around on me, I might not have begun the semester that way. But I did ask because I was curious if people's minds would change. I was also just curious going in how some of you might compare to one another. That I think for a lot of people, it's taken for granted. The vote is important. The vote matters, and you don't question that. But as we saw, there were a range of opinions there. For me, I'll admit it's a lot more complicated than when I first started voting. Now, I have voted in every federal election since I turned 18. My first semester of college, I got to cast my first ballot. I was proud of it. I have not missed a federal election since. And since moving to Bowling Green, I've started paying a lot more attention to local politics. I vote every time that there is something to vote on, whether it is a levy, whether it is local officials, doesn't matter. So I do take it very seriously. I value my vote. I think I have a lot of the same frustrations that many Americans do in terms of what impact is my vote having and what are my options as a voter. For impact, I think many Americans are frustrated. They think that what does my one little voice mean when a lot of the machinery of American politics is controlled outside of the ballot? What does it mean when I think the most recent study on 2024 indicated that nearly 1 in 5 campaign dollars donated towards the 2024 campaigns came from a total of 300 billionaires.
Wow.
Compared to 2008, when billionaires as a class contributed less than 0.5% before Citizens United came down from the U.S. Supreme Court. I understand a lot of folks who are frustrated that what impact does this have on our democracy? What impact does this have on both political parties? And that leads to my second problem, which is our allegiance to the two-party system. So many Americans say, well, I vote for this party. I don't necessarily agree with everything. I wish they would do this. I wish they would do that. But what are my options? Well, in a lot of countries, there are more than two options. In some places here in the U.S., on the local level, there are more than two options. But we treat anything outside of that as if it's almost a crime against voting itself. And so as a voter, I take my duty seriously. I exercise that vote every chance I get, and I still have doubts in the back of my mind. What impact is it having? So I'm not sure I can give you a nice, neat answer there, but as much as I can, I still do value the vote. I will still continue to exercise the vote. I will also recognize that voting is not the only way that we can be citizens. If there's anything that frustrates me, it's when we limit the ways that we can influence the system to only talk about voting. And indeed, the history of voting rights in this country indicates that the people who were able to secure the right to vote, who changed voting rights laws, had to do so by working outside of that system. They had to find ways to pressure that system. And if we think that those days are over, if we think that the only way we can ever influence the system again is by working through the ballot, then we're ignoring what history actually teaches us.
Yeah. And I remember when I came to your class, I had that assumption that, oh, we all get the right to vote, so we're Americans, we can just vote. And I know that a lot of Americans have that assumption, but it's because of your class now that I realize that's not true. Not every American citizen just has the right to vote, which might shock a few members of our audience. So my next question is, one, could you please inform us what barriers to voting exist today that prevent U.S. citizens from accessing the polls? And then two, for the second part, who do those barriers tend to affect the most?
Okay. The barriers that exist today, I would argue some of them are built into the system in ways that have become socially acceptable. And some of them act as byproducts of other inequalities that already exist. So in the first category, in terms of socially acceptable ways to disenfranchise people, the biggest one I can think of is felony disenfranchisement. That aside from the fact that most people who are currently occupying jails and prisons across the United States cannot vote, aside from that, there are so many restrictions post-sentencing that continue to hound people and that keep a significant number of people from even being able to register. In some cases, this may include states where if you have a felony on your record, you cannot vote. In some states, it's if you are on probation, you may not vote. If you're on parole, you may not vote. Until all of those things are satisfied, your right to vote is denied. As of a few years ago, this affected more than 6 million people in the United States, of which I think about 3/4 of those were not actually in jail or prison at the time.
Did you say 3/4?
3/4.
That's way more than I thought. 3/4.
So if we take even just I think it was roughly 6.1 million who were affected by this nationally. For context, in the 2024 election here in Ohio, about 5.7 million people cast a ballot for president of the United States. So this is more than what our state has to offer in terms of voting for president.
Wow.
These are, of course, spread over throughout the union, unevenly distributed, I might add, but the impact is still there. The impact at the local level, the state level, and definitely at the federal level matters. And I said that it's socially acceptable. These felony disenfranchisement laws, some of them go back to the colonial era. Some of them became strengthened during Reconstruction. And ironically, some scholars said that the strengthening during Reconstruction was actually to go after former Confederates to make sure that if they were engaging in lawlessness, and especially efforts to restrict the rights of the formerly enslaved, we would have a weapon against them to make sure they didn't just instantly regain the right to vote. Unfortunately, it got turned ultimately against African Americans and other people of color, as well as low-income people, rather than the folks that it was originally intended against. Now, those remain with us to this day. Those unfortunately have a disproportionate impact on the groups I just mentioned. But well beyond that are ones that, as I said, build on existing inequalities. That can include inequalities across class lines, across race lines, sex, etc. So among the many barriers that can still exist, we have the push for voter ID laws in recent years. We'll probably talk about this a little bit more later.
My next question's about that.
But we can get into more detail then. But this has been a big part of the most recent wave from 2013 to the present of new restrictive laws that have absolutely nothing in them regarding race, gender, or other identity markers, but that end up affecting these communities because of other conditions that exist for them. We have very firm evidence that people of color are less likely than white people to have certain kinds of government issued IDs. We know that younger people are less likely to have some of those IDs. We know that the elderly are less likely to have those IDs. Indeed, one of the biggest victims of some of these voter ID laws are college students. And you put these groups together, and suddenly patterns emerge in terms of who's going to be negatively affected by these laws. Most of that comes down to who has documentation to be able to get IDs in the first place, but also who can afford certain types of identification. When Texas moved to amend its laws in 2013 to impose strict voter ID standards in the immediate aftermath of Shelby County v. Holder, literally the same day the ruling came down, they passed a new voter ID law by midnight in Texas, one that was ultimately struck down by the courts. And they struck it down because it excluded more than 600,000 people who would otherwise be eligible to vote. And among them, large numbers of Latinos, large numbers of African Americans, large numbers of low-income people. Beyond that, we start getting into a lot of administrative things, sometimes hampering the ability, even if it's just through minutia, hampering the ability to easily register to vote. This can be by consolidating it into, oh, you can't just register to vote anywhere. You have to, let's say, go to the county seat to be able to do it. In some cases, it's restricting the ability to register by saying, oh, we'll no longer accept them from a third party. You have to do it in person. So if people are out there trying to get folks registered to vote, as we see all the time on campus, some places are moving to make that illegal. So suddenly the barriers, yes, they exist to casting your ballot in a lot of ways, but it's more how can we keep you from registering or find ways to kick you off of voter registration. We could go into much more detail, but I know that some of your questions are also going to get into this.
Yes, because my next question is about the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act,
Yes.
better known as the SAVE Act, which just passed in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington. And with this act, it will, if passed all the way through, require citizens to provide proof of citizenship with a birth certificate or a passport, which are some of those forms of voter ID laws that you were just talking about,
Yeah.
that not a lot of people, less people than expected, have access to those documents. And so using your knowledge of the literature that analyzes the effects of voter ID, such as what you've taught in class, how might an act like the SAVE Act impact voters?
Well, one of the things we need to understand, the SAVE Act is practically unprecedented at the federal level in terms of imposing a new limit on how people can register to vote and then how people can cast their vote. Historically, within the United States, there has been a big emphasis on the states being allowed to dictate primary voting rights policy. Under our federalist system, the states are typically granted this with very few limitations in our Constitution. Indeed, one of the things that surprises people is the original Constitution, as written in 1787, says almost nothing about voting, except for some little clauses about, well, voting for the House of Representatives should be the same laws in place for voting in whatever your larger state legislature house is. Outside of that, the things that have come into the Constitution since then have just been, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, previous condition of servitude, cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, cannot impose a poll tax, cannot discriminate on the basis of age for people 18 and older. And then beyond that, it only added the 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators. That's about it. Otherwise, it leaves everything in the hands of the states themselves. So this is a big step in a different direction. Now, The state laws that had been passed, especially over the last roughly 13 years regarding voter ID, there have been a lot of issues raised with the types of IDs that were permissible under that, including the tendency to exclude certain forms of ID that would address the concerns I raised earlier. Some states, for example, you can't use a student ID in order to vote. You may not be able to use a military ID. You may not be able to use IDs for accessing certain kinds of public services. But this one goes far beyond that when it comes to registering and requiring proof of citizenship. Those types of identification, a lot of Americans simply don't have. Roughly half of Americans do not have a passport, which would be one of the primary ways under this law that you could prove citizenship. Significant numbers of people may not have access to their original birth certificate. And for immigrants, there's the added requirement that you would have to provide proof of naturalization. Now, compounding this, however, is that the language of the law also stipulates that you need to provide citizenship proof in order to register, and then you need certain types of ID with matching name and address to what is on file in order to vote. That's a part of it we're not talking about nearly enough. Roughly 50 million Americans do not have a state ID that perfectly matches both the name and address that would be on file with them as voters. And this does disproportionately affect, again, people of color. But if we start looking at things that, okay, how do you match your name? How do you match your address? Other groups start getting affected that we don't automatically think of as being disenfranchised. One of the biggest groups that's affected by this act, of course, is married and divorced women. If you changed your name when you got married and you don't have, say, a birth certificate that then matches, what do you do? People have raised this question. People have raised possible legislative answers to that question. And so far, the legislation itself has not changed. You still need one of those primary documents in order to prove citizenship, and then you need something to show this is my name, this is my address, done. People who move, including members of the military, including people who have been displaced, especially by natural disasters, and again, college students.
Yeah, like me. I'm from Michigan, but I tend to vote. The last few elections, I have voted because of my Bowling Green address.
Yeah, there are so many people who vote. As college students, you are permitted to vote wherever it is you're residing during the school year. So if you're living on campus, you have a perfect right to register and vote there.
That's what I do.
The vast majority of students here do not live in Bowling Green or do not live locally and commute. Most of them are coming from elsewhere, and if they choose to vote in Bowling Green under this act, it becomes that much harder to do so. Unless they are willing to completely change their ID for the duration of college in order to make it match the local registration, then they may not be able to cast a vote. What happens then if you come here as a first-year student, you register with an address that puts you in one of the dorms, and then you move off campus? That also means multiple times just during college, you're going to have to change that ID.
And I have done that.
Yeah.
I've signed up under my Cole Hall, residence hall here during my first year, and now I vote off of my address. That's an apartment.
I think these are groups that people, again, don't think about when we think of disenfranchisement. I think because of the history of disenfranchisement, we're more likely to think in terms of race and in terms of sex. But very quickly, other groups start coming into play that on the surface don't seem very vulnerable, and yet under this act, they're going to be directly under the microscope. This is before we get into the, roughly 21 million Americans who don't have a state-issued driver's license. This is before we get into the problems of securing the documentation, paying for the documentation in order to get the types of IDs that would be acceptable, and especially the ones that prove citizenship. This has, unfortunately, the ability to disenfranchise a record-breaking number of people that could result in massive changes to the political structures as we know it. And it should be kept in mind that the current administration has made this a major priority. At the time that we're filming this, just the beginning of this week, the president announced he would not sign any other legislation until Congress had passed the SAVE Act. And he insisted that it not be a watered down version, that it be with all of these full restrictions in there. So we're heading to some kind of political standoff around this one way or another, where either it gets passed and other legislation starts moving through, or we may be facing the prospect of a government shutdown if Congress does not disenfranchise millions of American voters.
And this is a deeper subject, and I know you could probably talk about this for a while, but could you follow up with that and continue to explain what it says about how our country perceives who citizens are in America?
Yeah. It's important to keep in mind that for a long time, the courts stressed a difference between citizen and voter, that one did not automatically lead to the other. Some of the most important cases, for example, about women's rights to vote, stress that, oh yes, we've seen them as citizens since the founding of the Republic and even going back to colonial times, but that didn't mean we saw them as voters. That didn't mean that we automatically granted them that right of citizenship. It takes a very long time before citizenship becomes more firmly equated with the right to vote. And really, it is the struggles of the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement that solidify that in the minds of most Americans. So the changes that they brought about lead to this period now where we assume an important aspect of citizenship is suffrage, is the right to vote. Now, throughout American history, how we view citizenship with regard to different identities has always been contested. There has unfortunately been a very long tradition of assuming that only certain types of people automatically get the benefit of being assumed as citizens. That the most glaring example, of course, is equating it with whiteness. But often the status of men, of course, also took precedence over the status of women. The idea that not just citizenship, but the ability to be an engaged citizen, to be a voter, to hold political power was equated with white men was unfortunately a fact of political life for much of our nation's history. We saw brief blips where that was challenged. We saw Reconstruction, the rise of black men as voters, hundreds of black elected officials in a very short period of time, and then we saw the long-term project of restricting that, of saying that, okay, we'll recognize you as citizens, we don't necessarily have to recognize you as voters. Mm-hmm. That separation, again, is important here because they wanted to make it clear, oh, we see you as citizens because the Constitution requires us to see you as citizens. We'll see some of you as voters if we need to.
Yeah,
but
you're referring to the 15th Amendment.
Yes.
My midterm assignment was to explain how African Americans still were not able to vote despite the 15th Amendment, which puts down on paper their legal right to vote. And so it was explaining that, and the institutions and structure of a lot of times the state governments that wrote in loopholes, exceptions, ways around the 15th Amendment.
And what happened with that and how it ties in with citizenship is very much connected to what is happening now. That much of what happened in response to the 15th Amendment is how can we restrict the right to vote on the basis of race without admitting that we're restricting the right to vote on the basis of race? How do we come up with all of these quote-unquote colorblind ways of doing it, whether it's through literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, white primaries? How do we do this in a way that the courts will sign off on? And that was a big part of how it happened, that they realized the courts would allow it as long as there was nothing overtly in the law that says we're discriminating against this one group. The devil was in the enforcement. That when you left the enforcement to other officials, you could play dumb and say, well, no, we just passed a law in order to protect the integrity of our elections, in order to make sure that only the best and most educated people are making these important decisions for us. In other words, they had the exact same playbook in the late 19th century that we're hearing now when it comes to allegations of voter fraud, when it comes to making sure that people are not cheating the system, making sure that non-citizens are not voting. Indeed, in our own time, and bringing it back to your question about citizenship specifically, in our own time, that's become the big rallying cry, keeping non-citizens from voting. Even the biggest proponents of these types of laws, when it comes to documenting non-citizen voting, have to admit that it is a non-issue, that these are a trickle at best among the hundreds of millions of votes being cast. Even groups like the Heritage Foundation have been able to confirm, I think, fewer than 100 criminal cases involving this over the last 40 years. So in some cases, when states do a deeper dive and try to look at, well, are non-citizens registering to vote? In some cases they are, and not voting. And then they get taken off the rolls and there's no harm, no foul. Louisiana just released last fall its own study of citizenship and voting, and what they found was that over the last 20 plus years, there were an average of about 2 non-citizens voting per year. 2. This is the state that gives us our current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and this is the state that he's using as an example of this is why we have to act, because non-citizens are supposedly voting in large numbers. No, there are a few localities that allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. There is not a single state in the union where non-citizens are permitted to vote at the federal level. And the instances where this happens are so few and far between that there has been absolutely no evidence of it affecting the outcomes of elections. Having said that, the proponents of these new restrictions keep trotting this out as this is what we have to fight against. This is the fraud that's taking place. This is swaying elections, when there's absolutely no evidence to the contrary. But the fear that non-citizens are swaying elections, and more particularly the fear that non-white non-citizens are swaying the election, unfortunately, it's a powerful argument that resonates with a significant part of the American public.
The United States has a long legislative history of expanding, or one can say protecting, the right to vote, most notably the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now I'm about to ask a 3-part question.
Okay.
Could you please give us an overview of why the Civil Rights Movement prioritized the Voting Rights Act, what changes the act brought, and where we see the impact today?
Okay. The Civil Rights Movement prioritized voting rights in part because of the direct impact they thought it would have on people's lived experiences and their legal status. We sometimes ignore the impact that voting has, especially at the local level, in dictating basic policies we live with every single day, from where roads are built to who has access to plumbing to funding of our public schools. These are things that were not certainly taken for granted, especially in Black and brown communities in the first half of the 20th century, where resources were systematically denied them and where the lack of political representation or participation helped to make that possible. 1957, when civil rights activists came to Washington, D.C. on the 3rd anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, they had a public rally of more than 25,000 people, led by a speech by Dr. Martin Luther King. And his refrain in that speech was, "Give us the vote." He kept coming back to that because he felt that if you empower people in these local communities, that it would have this huge ripple effect on the American society as a whole. He was pointing out not just the impact it had on resources, but on a variety of other things we don't automatically equate with voting. One of the biggest concerns for Black and brown folks at that time would have been the composition of juries. That when we convene juries, the people who are called for jury duty or to at least be in the pool are are called in from the pool of registered voters, which meant that in areas where black and brown political participation was essentially non-existent, all white juries were extremely common, with important ramifications for our criminal justice system and the outcomes there. So when people were thinking of it, it wasn't just we should have the right to cast a ballot. It's how does it get us resources? How does it help protect our rights? How does it protect us in the courtroom? And how does it help us hold politicians accountable and make sure they are actually doing something for our communities? So voting rights was a long-term goal of the movement even before we get into the 1950s and 1960s. And people at all levels were constantly pushing for this. They were pushing against the voting restrictions themselves, both in and out of court. They were trying to find ways to get around them, whether it was citizenship schools to prepare people for literacy tests, or just helping people figure out where do you go to register? How do you fill out the forms? How can you avoid all the little tricks that might be put in place to trip you up? All this comes to a head, of course, in the mid-1960s, and especially 1964-65. The Mississippi Freedom Summer of 64 highlighted the importance in the Deep South of having political parties that actually answered to the people and gave them an opportunity to participate. Of course, most people think of Selma, the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, and how that squarely put voting rights onto the national agenda at a time where some politicians thought, well, we just passed the 64 Civil Rights Act. We just took on legal segregation, discrimination in employment, discrimination in a host of areas. Surely we don't have to follow up on voting just yet. The civil rights movement said otherwise. And between the actual march in March of 65 and August of 65, it shows how quickly that helped to build momentum so that Congress wrote and passed a strong Voting Rights Act. The VRA itself is arguably the most significant piece of civil rights legislation in modern American history, both in terms of what it does and the impact that it's had. In terms of what it does, it was seen as a natural outgrowth of the 15th Amendment, that if the 15th Amendment bars discrimination on the basis of color or race, that, well, Congress should be able to follow up and enforce that. It included very strong language targeting any kinds of methods that were used, even otherwise lawful methods, that were directly targeting communities of color. Section 2 of the Act was very clear in that and wanted to cast as wide a net as possible because they knew both that there had been a lot of different methods used to discriminate and that in the aftermath of this, new ones were likely to come into existence. I think the most important thing to look at with the Voting Rights Act, though, as it was originally written in 65, were Sections 4B and Section 5. Section 4B helped to set up criteria for measuring who are the states that have been discriminating on the basis of race when it comes to voting rights. And it largely depended on recent presidential elections to see who had been allowed to register and who was actually participating at the ballot box. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of the jurisdictions that were seen to be violating this were in the South. There were some exceptions, some local exceptions in places like New York State, California. I think with some of the revisions, both Hawaii and Alaska also came under coverage here. But this became important because of Section 5. Section 5 was pre-clearance. And what it said is that if you were in violation of these criteria that we set up in 4B, that in order to change your voting rights laws, you had to submit them first to the federal government for review, either the Attorney General's office or the district court coming out of Washington, D.C. had to review them and make sure that these changes would not dilute the voting power of targeted minority groups. With that, you had a powerful new weapon from the federal government to make sure that new changes were not going to be implemented overnight to try to subvert what the VRA was trying to accomplish. And for basically the next 2 generations, this actually worked out quite well. The VRA would undergo some important revisions over time. It would be repassed every few years. And in the 1970s, for example, would include new language around language, making sure that people in areas where they had predominant, where they were taught languages other than English as the first language, such as Puerto Rico, that they would not face voting rights discrimination, that they would have access, for example, to translators at the ballot booth if necessary. In 1982, new language was added to look at the, quote, totality of circumstances. And this was in direct response to a legal challenge that had argued that that certain types of restrictions might be allowed under the VRA if they're not directly targeting race, if you can't show that this was the desired outcome. Instead, Congress put forth a set of criteria saying, well, under these different circumstances, these are the different things we can look at to try to measure, is this actually having a disproportionate impact on a certain group? And with that, we actually succeeded in very many ways in almost leveling the playing field for voters of color. By the time we fast forward to the 2008 presidential election, just 2 years after the last reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, this was the first election in American history where the percentage of Black registered voters who cast a ballot exceeded the percentage of white registered voters who cast a ballot. We were now almost to the point where the percentage of Black registered voters was close to their percentage of the overall population. In other words, the VRA had been a rousing success when it came to actually getting people registered and making sure they were voting with very, very few restrictions overall. This then had the domino effect, of course, of promoting people of color and women in positions of power, and especially expanding the field for Black elected officials and eventually for Latino Asian Americans as well. The number of Black elected officials alone more than quadrupled in the 30 plus years after the Voting Rights Act was passed. We're now at a point today where I believe more than a quarter of Congress is composed of people of color. So we're not quite equal yet, but we're seeing signs that we're moving in the right direction. Now, there are still big discrepancies at the local level that still need to be addressed, but the VRA made so much of this possible. And for most of its legislative history, it was not just seen as a success, it was seen as something that was politically popular on both sides of the aisle. When it passed again in 2006 and was signed into law by then President George W. Bush, it passed with almost no congressional opposition. It was seen as a given that we are going to reauthorize it, it will be signed into law, maybe some minor tweaks to it, and that's about it. The Shelby County decision in 2013 helps to change that, as does some of the rhetoric coming out of the 2008 presidential election. Because after the 2008 election, some conservatives began to target the VRA. Some of them started to argue not that it was a bad thing, but that it was no longer necessary.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edge, for your insight. I can't wait for the next episode because we'll talk about even more how the changes to voting in the VRA impacts us today and what our future of voting looks like. So stay tuned for that for next time. Thank you to the Depot social media and podcast team, Bryn Drayback, Julia Amlin, and Bryce. And special thanks to Falcon Radio and Professor Robert Alexander, our founder. I've been your host and researcher, Anna McRae. Make sure to join us next time at the Democracy Exchange.
Voting can be a complicated process, but it doesn't have to be. You have several options whether you're a college student or whoever you are. You can vote early at your Board of Elections before the election period. This can vary depending on the Board of Elections, so please look up your Board of Elections hours for early voting. You could also vote by mail or absentee voting. So you have to request an absentee ballot and then you send that into your Board of Elections. Or you can vote in person on Election Day. If you are a college student, you can register to vote with your permanent at-home address or your student address on campus. Here at BGSU, we have a student polling location in the Student Union on Election Day.